Have you ever wondered what happens when the world declares you inadequate, only for someone to see the extraordinary person everyone else overlooked? The December wind carried whispers through Westminster that evening, cruel and cutting as the ice forming on every fashionable window pane from Belgrave Square to Mayfair. Miss Louisa Ashley heard them all, though she had learned to keep her expression serene, her spine straight, her hands folded with the perfect composure that 6 governesses and 12 years of finishing had instilled. At 26, she had become a fixture of London society in the way that serviceable furniture becomes part of a room, noticed only when absent, appreciated never. The youngest daughter of a country baronet, with more lineage than fortune, Louisa possessed neither the golden curls that drew gentlemen's eyes, nor the porcelain complexion praised in drawing-room poetry. Her features were strong rather than delicate, her figure tall and angular rather than fashionably petite. She was, as Lady Pemberton had once declared with casual cruelty, perfectly adequate in every way, which was to say entirely unremarkable. The modiste had tried her best that afternoon, draping Louisa in deep forest green that at least brought warmth to her hazel eyes, but as she stood in the entrance of Hartfield House for the season's opening ball, Louisa understood with perfect clarity that no amount of silk could transform her into something she was not. Beautiful, desirable, worthy of notice. "Louisa, darling, do try to look less like you're attending a funeral," her mother whispered, adjusting the modest pearls at Louisa's throat with trembling fingers. Lady Ashley's own youth had been marked by extraordinary beauty that time, and 5 children had gradually eroded, leaving behind desperate determination that at least one daughter should secure the advantageous match that would restore their dwindling fortunes. "Lord Whitmore is here tonight, and though he's 60 if he's a day, he's wealthy. A pleasant smile might catch his attention." Louisa swallowed her reply and nodded, summoning the expression that had become her armour, a look of mild contentment that suggested nothing disturbed her placid thoughts. The ballroom glittered with 1,000 candles reflected in gilt mirrors, creating such studied magnificence that Louisa felt herself diminishing further, becoming smaller and greyer against such brilliance. She was halfway to the chairs where chaperones and spinsters gathered when a ripple of attention moved through the crowd like wind across water. "His Grace the Duke of Thornbury," the butler announced, and the collective intake of breath was audible. Louisa had heard of him, of course. Henry Collingwood, the 8th Duke of Thornbury, had inherited 3 years prior at 30, along with one of England's largest fortunes. He was extraordinarily particular, had rejected every marriage-minded mamma's offerings with polite finality, and appeared in society only when necessity demanded. He was quite simply the most eligible bachelor in England. Louisa watched with detached curiosity as he entered, surprised by what she saw. The newspapers had mentioned wealth and title, but failed to capture the intensity of his presence. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair falling across classical features, but it was not appearance that commanded attention. It was something in his bearing, the way his grey eyes surveyed the room with intelligence that seemed to catalogue everything and find most of it wanting. Lady Hartfield swept forward in greeting, while around them the ballroom reorganised with him as centre, young ladies positioning themselves in his line of sight, mammas calculating approach strategies. Louisa felt the familiar tug of invisibility pulling her toward the margins, where she could observe without being observed, exist without being seen. She had taken 3 steps when everything changed. The Duke's gaze swept across the ballroom with methodical precision, and then it stopped. On her. Louisa felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing, and for a moment, that stretched impossibly long, they simply looked at each other across the glittering space. His expression revealed nothing, no admiration certainly, but also no dismissal, merely an assessment so thorough and unhurried that heat rose to her cheeks despite herself. She was first to look away, dropping her gaze with the instinct of one who had learned never to presume attention meant anything beyond momentary curiosity. When she glanced up again, he had turned to greet Lord Hartfield, and Louisa released a breath she hadn't known she was holding. An aberration, she told herself, nothing more. But throughout the evening, as Louisa maintained her post among the unnoticed, she found her gaze drawn back to him repeatedly, watching as he danced with Lady Sophia Carrington, whose legendary beauty had inspired 3 duels, as he conversed with Miss Arabella Whitmore, whose wit was as celebrated as her father's banking fortune, and several times she caught him watching her. The evening unfolded with predictable rhythm, a quadrille with her cousin fulfilling family obligation, brief conversation with Mrs. Pembroke, and long stretches standing beside a potted palm while her mother made desperate attempts to catch Lord Whitmore's attention. It was during this latter period, while Louisa contemplated the particular shade of green in the palm's fronds and wondered if she might successfully disappear behind them entirely, that a voice spoke with such unexpected proximity that she started. "Forgive me, I did not mean to alarm you." The Duke of Thornbury stood less than 3 feet away, having approached with such silence she had not heard his footsteps. Up close, he was even more imposing, not merely in height, but in the intensity of focus he directed at her, as though she were the only person in a ballroom containing 200 souls. "Your Grace," Louisa managed, executing a flawless curtsy, though her pulse hammered. "I apologize. I was wool-gathering. Most unforgivably rude at a social gathering." Something that might have been amusement flickered across his features. "On the contrary, I find wool-gathering one of the more honest activities at these functions. At least it acknowledges the tedium, rather than pretending fascination with one's 50th consecutive discussion of weather." Louisa looked up, startled by the frankness. It was not the sort of thing one said in polite society, this admission that the endless round of balls might be anything other than delightful. "I'm not certain I should agree with such a statement, Your Grace," she said carefully, aware her mother watched from across the room with stunned hope that made Louisa's chest tighten with premature disappointment. "It would suggest I find Lady Hartfield's hospitality less than captivating." "And yet you've spent the last quarter hour studying that palm with the intensity of a botanist, making a groundbreaking discovery," he observed, grey eyes holding hers with directness, both unsettling and oddly exhilarating. "Forgive my presumption, but I suspect you find most of this rather tedious." Louisa knew she should deny it, produce the pleasant fiction expected. Instead, meeting those intelligent eyes that seemed to see past every carefully constructed defense, she found herself answering with uncharacteristic honesty. "I find it necessary, Your Grace, which is not quite the same as tedious, though neither is it precisely delightful." His expression shifted, revealing genuine interest rather than mere politeness. "Necessary. An interesting choice of words. Might I inquire what makes it so?" Louisa hesitated, wondering how much truth this man, who could have his choice of any woman, truly wanted from a plain spinster standing beside a palm. "I am 26 years old, Your Grace, with no fortune, no particular beauty, and no prospects beyond what these gatherings might provide. Attendance is not optional for one in my circumstances. It is a requirement of survival, though whether I shall ultimately survive it remains uncertain." She had said too much, revealed too much of the desperation beneath her composed exterior, but the Duke's expression did not change to pity or dismissal. Instead, he seemed to consider her words with seriousness they perhaps did not deserve. "You describe yourself with remarkable harshness, Miss Ashley. I know your name," he added, seeing her surprise. "I make it my business to know who populates these rooms. One cannot navigate society blind." "Then you know I am of no particular consequence," Louisa replied, finding strange freedom in this unexpected honesty. "There is no need for courtesy beyond what politeness demands." "Courtesy and honesty are not mutually exclusive," the Duke said, and now there was something in his voice that commanded her full attention, a quality she could not quite name, but that made her heartbeat quicken. In fact, I find their combination exceedingly rare and therefore valuable. You have been honest with me, Miss Ashley. Permit me to return the favour. I find you far more interesting than any of the celebrated beauties I have danced with this evening, none of whom could admit to finding any aspect of this carefully orchestrated cattle market tedious, despite the fact that their eyes glaze with boredom between smiles. Louisa stared at him, certain she had misheard. Your Grace, I cannot think what you mean. Can you not? He moved slightly closer, and Louisa became aware of subtle sandalwood and cold night hair clinging to his clothes. Very well, then allow me to be clearer. I am 35 years old, Miss Ashley, with a fortune that makes me perpetually suspect of every smile, every compliment, every declaration of interest. I have been pursued by every ambitious mamma in London, courted by young ladies who see only my title and wealth, and flattered by countless individuals who would not spare me a glance if I were a clerk in a counting house. And then I enter a ballroom and see a woman who looks at me with complete indifference, who stands beside a palm because she has given up pretending to find any of this enchanting. That, Miss Ashley, interests me greatly. The words seemed to echo impossibly in the space between them. I don't understand, Louisa whispered, her practiced composure cracking. What could you possibly want from me? A conversation, he said simply. One in which neither of us performs for the benefit of observers. One in which we might speak as two intelligent people rather than as Duke and desperate spinster, if you'll forgive my adopting your own brutal honesty. He paused, and something softened in his expression. Tomorrow afternoon, there is an exhibition of botanical illustrations at the Royal Society. I am told they are quite remarkable. Would you do me the honour of accompanying me? Your mother may serve as chaperone, naturally. Louisa felt words forming, the refusal that caution demanded, the protection against hope that had served her well through 6 seasons. But beneath his steady gaze, with the memory of his words still resonating, she found herself speaking differently. I would be honoured, Your Grace. The Duke smiled then, a transformation that made Louisa understand why he was considered handsome. Until tomorrow then, Miss Ashley. I look forward to our conversation about something other than weather. He bowed and withdrew, leaving Louisa standing beside the palm, with heart racing and mind whirling with questions she could not begin to answer. Across the room, her mother had collapsed into a chair, overcome by shock at seeing her unremarkable daughter command the Duke's attention. And throughout the remainder of the evening, Louisa felt the weight of every eye upon her, assessing, speculating, wondering what on earth the Duke of Thornbury could possibly see in plain Louisa Ashley that had escaped everyone else's notice. She wondered the same thing herself, even as something fragile and dangerous unfurled in her chest, something that felt perilously like hope. The morning following the ball dawned grey and cold, fog rolling through London streets like theatrical curtains. Louisa woke early, having slept fitfully through dreams that scattered the moment she reached for them, leaving only the impression of grey eyes and words too extraordinary to have been real. Perhaps, she thought as Martha helped her into a morning dress of modest blue wool, the entire encounter had been imagination's desperate rebellion against years of invisibility. But when she descended to breakfast, she found her mother already seated with a letter in trembling hands, an expression wavering between euphoria and terror. "Louisa," Lady Ashley breathed, holding up cream-coloured cardstock as though it were a religious relic. "A confirmation from His Grace. He will call at 2:00. This is not a dream. This is truly happening." Louisa took her seat, accepting tea with hands steadier than she felt. "It is merely an outing to view botanical illustrations, Mamma. An intellectual exercise. You must not read more into it than exists." But even as she spoke cautionary words, Louisa's own thoughts betrayed her with speculation. Why had he singled her out? What had he truly seen when he looked at her? Could it be possible that someone of his consequence genuinely found her interesting rather than merely suitable for passing an afternoon? The question circled as she mechanically consumed toast she could not taste and listened to her mother's increasingly elaborate theories. At precisely 2 o'clock, the Duke's carriage arrived, black-lacquered perfection, pulled by matched greys that probably cost more than Louisa's entire wardrobe. He handed them both into the vehicle with practiced courtesy, his expression revealing nothing as he took the seat opposite Louisa. The Royal Society occupied an impressive building in Somerset House, its halls filled with accumulated knowledge of centuries and quiet intensity of serious scholars. As they walked through galleries lined with specimens and instruments, the Duke proved unexpectedly knowledgeable, discussing latest theories in natural philosophy with enthusiasm that transformed his usually reserved demeanour. "You are well versed in botanical science, Your Grace," Louisa observed, pausing before a particularly intricate illustration of an orchid that seemed to possess more colours than nature should reasonably allow a single flower. "I would not have expected such expertise from one whose duties surely occupy him with more political matters. And I would not have expected you to make assumptions about what I might or might not know," he replied, but there was warmth in his voice that softened any criticism. "We all contain multitudes, Miss Ashley. It is merely that society prefers we reveal only the expected facets of ourselves." Louisa glanced at him, finding his grey eyes already upon her with that same intensity that had unsettled her the previous evening. "And which facets do you reveal in society, Your Grace?" "The ones that keep people at a comfortable distance," he answered without hesitation. "The remote duke, the careful aristocrat, the man whose wealth and title make him simultaneously desired and feared. It is exhausting, but effective." "And which facets do you conceal?" The question escaped before Louisa could recall it. Too personal, too presumptuous. But the Duke did not seem offended. Instead, he moved closer to examine the orchid, though his attention remained clearly fixed on her. "The ones that matter," he said quietly. "The person I might be if I were not perpetually performing for an audience that sees only what I represent rather than who I am." Louisa understood that statement in her bones, felt the resonance of it in every carefully constructed expression she had worn for 6 seasons, every pleasant smile that disguised disappointment, every performance of contentment that concealed loneliness. "I know something of that," she admitted, her own voice dropping to match his confidential tone. "Though my performance is different from yours, I perform adequacy rather than superiority, pleasant acceptance rather than desired exclusivity, but it is still a performance. Yes." The Duke turned to face her fully, and the intensity in his gaze made Louisa's breath catch. "That is precisely what I saw last night. Not someone performing delight or enthusiasm or desperate interest, but someone who had stopped performing entirely. Do you have any idea how rare that is? How refreshing?" Behind them, Lady Ashley coughed delicately, a reminder of her presence and propriety. The Duke stepped back, professional distance reasserting itself, but something had shifted between them, some acknowledgement that passed without words. They continued through the exhibition, their conversation ranging from botany to literature to latest parliamentary debates, and Louisa found herself speaking with an ease she had never experienced in any social setting. The Duke listened, truly listened, asking questions that suggested genuine interest rather than polite duty, offering observations that revealed nimble mind and unexpected humour. When a particular illustration of a carnivorous plant prompted his wry comment that it seemed singularly well suited for disposing of tiresome dinner guests, Louisa laughed with such genuine amusement that several scholars turned to stare. "Forgive me," she said, trying to compose herself. "I should not laugh so loudly in such a scholarly setting." "Why not?" the Duke asked, and his slight smile suggested he had valued that unguarded moment. "If scholarship cannot accommodate joy, it has lost something essential." As they departed some 2 hours later, the Duke handed Louisa into the carriage with a touch that lingered perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Miss Ashley," he said, "might I presume to call upon you again? There is a lecture on astronomical discoveries at the Royal Academy next week. I find I would greatly enjoy hearing your thoughts on the relationship between scientific discovery and philosophical implications. Louisa should have demurred, should have protected herself against disappointment that seemed inevitable when this incomprehensible attention faded, as it surely must. But looking into those grey eyes that saw her with such disconcerting clarity, she found herself incapable of refusal. "I would be delighted, Your Grace." The smile he gave her in response held something that made her heart perform an uncomfortable, acrobatic feat. As their carriage rolled back through fog-shrouded streets, Lady Ashley barely contained herself until they crossed their own threshold, before seizing Louisa's hands with trembling fingers. "Did you hear how he spoke to you? Did you see how he looked at you? Louisa, this is extraordinary. The Duke of Thornbury is courting you." Louisa extracted her hands gently, moving to the fire. "He is being kind, Mamma, nothing more. We share certain intellectual interests, that is all." But even as she spoke cautionary words, Louisa could feel them for the lie they were. This was something more than kindness, though what precisely it might be remained terrifyingly unclear. The weeks that followed took on a quality Louisa would later struggle to describe, as though she had stepped through some invisible threshold into a parallel existence where impossible things occurred with calm regularity. The Duke called every 3 days with perfect consistency, always with proper notice, always with an intellectual destination that provided legitimate excuse for their continued acquaintance. They visited museums and galleries, attended lectures and exhibitions, walked through botanical gardens where winter had stripped plants to essential structures, and through it all they talked. The Duke proved unlike any gentleman Louisa had ever encountered, not because he was particularly charming or effusive with compliments, but because he spoke to her as an equal. He asked her opinions on matters of substance and listened to her answers with focused attention, often pressing her to elaborate when she attempted self-deprecating dismissals that years of social training had ingrained. When she mentioned having read a particular philosophical treatise, he did not express surprise at a woman engaging with such material, but instead immediately engaged her in debate about its central arguments. When she admitted to an interest in astronomy beyond poetic contemplation of stars, he arranged a private viewing at the Royal Observatory, where they spent 3 hours examining celestial charts while her mother dozed in a chair, finally defeated by determination to chaperone every encounter. "You hide your intelligence," he observed, one afternoon as they stood before a painting in the National Gallery, ostensibly studying classical composition, but actually engaged in discussion about philosophical implications of beauty. Why? Louisa considered the question, unused to such directness about matters she had never acknowledged aloud. "Because intelligence in a woman of no particular beauty or fortune is threatening rather than attractive," she said finally. "It suggests she might have opinions, might question, might be less biddable than desirable. Better to be thought pleasant and accommodating than clever and difficult." "By that logic," the Duke replied, his eyes on the painting rather than her face, "I should hide my fortune and title to avoid people who want me only for those attributes. But then I would be left with no one at all, pretending to be something lesser to avoid those who want me for wrong reasons." "It's not the same," Louisa protested. "You have the luxury of choice. I have only the necessity of being chosen." He turned to her then, and the intensity in his grey eyes made her breath catch. "Do you truly believe that? That you have no choice? That your only value lies in whether someone deigns to select you?" The question hung between them, and Louisa realized with uncomfortable clarity that she had believed exactly that for so long it had become fundamental truth. Her worth measured only by whether someone found her adequate enough to marry. Her choices limited to acceptance or refusal of whatever attention came her way. She had no answer that would not reveal too much, so she remained silent, returning her gaze to the painting. "Louisa," the Duke said, and it was the first time he had used her given name. The intimacy of it sending warmth cascading through her. "May I be honest with you?" "You have been honest with me from our first conversation," she replied quietly. "It is one of the things I value most." "Then allow me to continue that honesty," he said, and something in his voice made her turn to face him fully, uncaring that her mother sat just yards away, that other patrons moved through the gallery around them. "When I look at you, I do not see plainness. I see strength in features that speak of character rather than fashionable delicacy. I see intelligence in eyes that assess and understand rather than merely reflect admiration. I see dignity in posture that has been maintained through years of being overlooked. And I see possibility in a person who has survived society's casual cruelty without becoming cruel herself." Louisa felt tears threatening and forced them back through sheer will. "Your Grace, you cannot mean such things. You are accustomed to beauty far beyond anything I possess. Every woman in London would give everything to have you look at her as you're looking at me now." "And that," he said with quiet intensity, "is precisely why none of them interest me. They would give everything to be looked at by a duke, by a title, by a fortune. You barely believed I could be looking at you at all. Do you understand the difference? You do not see my consequence, Louisa. You see me, and I find that I rather desperately want to be seen." The words were too much, too overwhelming, too impossible to believe. Louisa stepped back, her hand rising unconsciously to her throat, where her pulse hammered visibly. "I don't understand what you want from me," she whispered. "I am offering you what you have offered me," he replied. "Honesty, company, the possibility of being known rather than merely observed, and perhaps, if you find my company as agreeable as I find yours, something more permanent." The implication in those last words sent shock cascading through Louisa's system. "Your Grace, you cannot be suggesting that is impossible. Your position demands someone of beauty and consequence, someone who would reflect well upon your name. I am neither of those things." "You underestimate yourself severely," the Duke said, frustration edging into his careful control. "And you overestimate the value I place on beauty and consequence. I have been surrounded by both my entire life, Louisa, and I can attest that neither guarantees worth." Before Louisa could respond, Lady Ashley's voice intruded, calling that they should perhaps proceed to the next gallery. The moment fractured, public propriety reasserting itself, but as the Duke offered his arm to guide her forward, Louisa felt his words settling into her consciousness, like seeds that would require careful examination before she could understand what they might grow into. That evening brought unexpected complications. Louisa's eldest brother Thomas arrived from the country, summoned by their mother's increasingly excited letters about the Duke's attention. Thomas possessed their father's rigid sense of propriety and an older brother's conviction that his judgment superseded all others. Over dinner, he interrogated Louisa about the Duke's intentions with the subtlety of a magistrate examining a criminal. "The man is 9 years your senior, Louisa, with wealth and position far beyond our modest status. What precisely does he want from you?" Thomas demanded, attacking his mutton with unnecessary vigour. "Why is he not courting one of the celebrated beauties? What makes you think this is anything more than a diversion for a bored aristocrat?" Each question landed like a blow, articulating every fear Louisa herself harboured, but had tried to suppress. "I cannot speak to His Grace's motivations," she said with hard-won calm. "I know only that he has been unfailingly respectful and that our conversations have been intellectually stimulating. If you question his character, perhaps you should address him directly, rather than interrogating me." Thomas's face reddened. "I question his intentions toward my sister. It is my duty to protect you from fortune hunters and scoundrels, even those who come dressed in ducal finery." "Fortune hunters?" Louisa could not suppress a bitter laugh. "Thomas, I possess no fortune to hunt. If anything, I am the liability, the spinster daughter who has cost the family 6 seasons' worth of expenses with nothing to show for it." Which is precisely why the Duke's attention is suspicious, Thomas insisted. Men of his consequence do not court unremarkable women without ulterior motive. Perhaps he has made some wager with his friends, or perhaps he seeks to make a former lover jealous by pretending interest elsewhere. Either way, I forbid you from seeing him again until I have investigated his character more thoroughly. The pronouncement fell into stunned silence. Lady Ashley gasped in horror at seeing their one chance at elevation threatened. Louisa simply looked at her brother with new eyes, seeing clearly for the first time how her own family perceived her. Not as a person deserving of genuine affection, but as a commodity so devalued that any interest must be fraudulent. "You have no right to forbid me anything," Louisa said quietly, rising from the table with dignity that cost her everything to maintain. "I am 26 years old, Thomas, not a child requiring your permission. If the Duke's intentions prove false, I shall bear that disappointment as I have borne all the others. But I will not surrender the first genuine connection I have experienced in 6 years of London seasons, simply because you cannot conceive of someone valuing me." She left the dining room before he could respond, before her mother could add her own complicated mixture of support and worry, before the tears threatening to spill could provide Thomas with satisfaction of seeing her weakness. In her chamber, Martha found her sitting by the window, staring out at fog-shrouded streets with dry eyes and clenched hands. "Miss Louisa," the maid said gently, "your brother means well, even if his manner is harsh." "Does he?" Louisa turned from the window. "Or does he merely articulate what everyone thinks but is too polite to say? That I am too plain, too old, too insignificant to attract genuine interest from someone like the Duke? That there must be some trick, some deception, because what else could explain it?" Martha knelt beside her chair, taking Louisa's cold hands in warm ones. "I've worked in noble houses since I was 12 years old, miss. I've seen plenty of dukes and lords and gentlemen of consequence. Most of them wouldn't notice a servant girl if she stood ablaze in front of them. But His Grace, he notices everything. The way he looks at you, miss, that's not deception. That's a man who's found something he didn't know he was searching for." The words offered comfort Louisa desperately wanted to believe but feared to embrace. What if she allowed herself to hope, to believe that this impossible thing might be real, only to discover it had been illusion all along? The fall from such a height would destroy what remained of her already battered spirit. A knock at her chamber door interrupted spiraling thoughts. Her mother entered, expression a complex mixture of anxiety and determination. "Louisa, you must forgive your brother. He's merely concerned for your welfare." "He called me unremarkable, Mamma," Louisa said, the word tasting of ash. "He suggested no man could genuinely want me without ulterior motive. How am I to forgive being told my own family believes me unworthy of sincere affection?" Lady Ashley sank into the chair opposite her daughter, suddenly looking every one of her 50 years. "Oh, my dear girl, you must understand that Thomas speaks from fear, not malice. We have watched you endure 6 seasons of being passed over, of standing at edges while lesser girls were chosen. We have seen you slowly disappear into yourself, becoming smaller and quieter with each disappointment, and now suddenly, inexplicably, the most eligible man in England shows interest, and it terrifies us because we cannot bear to see you hurt again." The honesty in her mother's voice penetrated Louisa's defensive walls. "You think I will be hurt," she said softly. "You think his interest cannot possibly be genuine." "I think," her mother said carefully, "that miracles are rare, and that we have not been a family acquainted with them. I think that your heart, which you have guarded so carefully, is at risk, and that frightens me more than anything. But Louisa, I also think that if you do not allow yourself this risk, if you retreat from the possibility, simply because it seems impossible, you will regret it for the remainder of your days." Louisa looked at her mother with surprise, seeing perhaps for the first time the woman behind desperate matchmaking, the mother who watched her daughter's pain and felt her own helplessness to ease it. "What would you have me do?" she whispered, Lady Ashley reached across space between them, taking Louisa's face in both hands with unusual tenderness. "I would have you be brave, my darling girl. I would have you believe, just this once, that perhaps you are worth the attention he offers. I would have you stop seeing yourself through society's cruel eyes and start seeing yourself as he apparently sees you, as worthy of notice, of respect, of affection. And if it ends in heartbreak, then at least you will have had this moment of being truly seen." The words settled into Louisa's heart, permission she had not known she needed. That night, she slept with her mother's blessing, warming her like a shield against her brother's doubts and society's whispers. And in the morning, when a note arrived from the Duke requesting permission to call that afternoon on a matter of some importance, she sent her acceptance without hesitation. The Duke of Thornbury arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, but this time without the excuse of an intellectual outing. He was shown into the drawing room where Louisa waited with her mother and, unfortunately, Thomas, who had positioned himself like a sentinel determined to protect his sister from whatever duplicity he imagined forthcoming. The Duke's expression remained composed as he greeted each of them with perfect courtesy, but Louisa saw tension in his shoulders, slight tightness around his eyes that suggested he understood this would not be a simple social call. "Lord Ashley," he addressed Thomas with formal respect due to the head of family, "I appreciate your presence, as what I have come to discuss concerns your sister directly, and should therefore be addressed with proper family representation." Thomas's suspicion was palpable. "Indeed, Your Grace, I confess myself curious about what matter of importance brings you here today." The Duke did not flinch from barely concealed hostility. Instead, he turned to Louisa, and the softness that entered his expression made her breath catch. "Miss Ashley, we have spent these past weeks in conversation that has ranged across numerous subjects. I have come to value your insight, your honesty, and your company more than I can adequately express. You have become essential to my happiness in ways I did not anticipate when I first saw you standing beside that palm at the Hartfield ball." Louisa felt her heart beginning to race, understanding dawning even before he continued. "You make me laugh with observations others would never dare voice. You challenge my thinking without seeking to merely agree or flatter. You see past my title to the person I am when freed from social performance, and I find that I cannot imagine my future without you in it." He turned back to Thomas, his bearing shifting to that of a duke making a formal address. "Lord Ashley, I am here to request permission to court your sister with the express intention of asking for her hand in marriage, should she prove willing. I can offer her a comfortable life, a position of respect, and my sincere affection. I hope that will be sufficient." The silence that followed was absolute. Thomas sat frozen, his earlier suspicions apparently having never extended to the possibility of an actual proposal. Lady Ashley had her hand pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. And Louisa simply stared at the Duke, this incomprehensible man who was offering her everything she had stopped allowing herself to want. "This is irregular," Thomas managed finally. "You have known my sister only a few weeks. How can you be certain of your feelings? How can she be certain of yours?" "As to the first question," the Duke replied with composure Louisa could only admire, "I have spent more substantive time in conversation with your sister than most couples manage during an entire courtship. I know her mind, her character, her values. I know how she thinks and what she cares about beyond mere social success. That is a foundation for marriage far stronger than most unions built on longer acquaintance but shallower connection. As to the second question, only Louisa can answer whether she believes my feelings genuine." All eyes turned to Louisa, waiting for her response to the impossible question. She looked at the Duke, this man who had seen past every barrier to something she had nearly stopped believing existed, her own worth as a person rather than as ornamental accessory to someone else's life. She thought of their conversations, of the way he listened, of the respect with which he treated her thoughts and opinions. She thought of how he made her laugh and challenged her assumptions and somehow made her feel both comfortable and vitalized in his presence. "I believe him," she said quietly, then more firmly. "I believe his feelings are genuine because he has demonstrated them in every interaction. He has treated me with respect and honesty. He has valued my mind as much as any physical attribute, and he has given me something I did not realize I had lost, the ability to imagine a future that might contain happiness rather than merely adequacy." She turned to her brother, seeing his continuing doubt, and felt something fierce rising in her chest. "Thomas, I know I am not beautiful by society's standards. I know I am older than most brides, and possess no fortune to recommend me. I know that by every conventional measure, the Duke's interest should be impossible. But I also know that I have spent 6 years being invisible, being dismissed, being told in 1,000 subtle ways that I was insufficient. And now someone sees me, truly sees me, and values what he finds. If that is delusion, then I choose delusion over the safety of continued invisibility." The Duke crossed to where she sat, dropping to one knee before her with a grace that somehow made the theatrical gesture seem natural. From his coat, he withdrew a ring, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds that caught afternoon light in crystalline fractures. "Louisa Ashley," he said, and his voice held nothing of ducal authority, only vulnerable honesty. "Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Not because I require a duchess and you happen to be available, but because I require you specifically, your mind and your company and your particular way of seeing the world. I promise to value you, to listen to you, to never dismiss or diminish you. I promise to see you always as you are, not as society expects you to be, and I promise to spend my life ensuring you never doubt your worth again." Louisa looked into his grey eyes, seeing sincerity and hope, and yes, affection, perhaps even the beginnings of love. She thought of the woman she had been at the Hartfield ball just weeks ago, resigned to invisibility and slow diminishment. She thought of the woman she was becoming in his company, someone braver and more honest, someone willing to claim space rather than apologize for existing. She thought of all the years she had waited to be chosen, never understanding that the greatest choice was the one she herself could make. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, Henry, I will marry you." The smile that transformed his face was radiant, and as he slipped the ring onto her finger, Louisa felt something fundamental shifting in her understanding of herself. This was not rescue or salvation or answer to desperate prayers. This was partnership, mutual choice, two people finding in each other what they had not found elsewhere. As the Duke rose and, propriety momentarily forgotten, pulled her to her feet and into his arms, Louisa heard her mother's joyful sobs and even her brother's grudging congratulations. But more than that, she heard the silence inside herself, the absence of that critical voice that had whispered insufficiency for so many years. She was chosen not despite her plainness, but because of her substance. Not as consolation, but as preference. Not for what she represented, but for who she was. The wedding was planned for the end of the season, giving enough time for proper arrangements, but not so long that speculation could fester into scandal. In the weeks between proposal and ceremony, Louisa found herself transformed in society's eyes from unmarriageable spinster to the woman who had captured the impossible Duke, though she noticed with wry amusement that the transformation was entirely external. She remained exactly who she had always been, strong-featured, intelligent, uncompromising in her honesty. But now those qualities were reframed as the very attributes that had attracted a duke too discerning to be swayed by mere beauty. "They think I bewitched you," she told Henry one afternoon as they walked through Hyde Park. "Lady Pemberton suggested I must possess extraordinary talents in private to have secured your attention, with implications I prefer not to examine too closely." Henry laughed, the sound rich and unguarded. "Let them speculate. I find their confusion deeply satisfying. For years, they have pursued me with their beautiful daughters, certain that loveliness and breeding were all that mattered, To have their assumptions so thoroughly overturned provides me with perhaps uncharitable amusement. You are wicked, Louisa said, but she smiled as she said it, secure now in ways she had not been weeks earlier. Should I be concerned that I am marrying a man who takes pleasure in society's consternation? Only if you are not yourself amused by watching them attempt to categorize what they cannot understand, he replied, covering her hand on his arm with his own. We defy their narrow definitions, Louisa. We are a duke and a woman deemed plain, who somehow suit each other perfectly, despite all their rules about how such things should work. I find that rather magnificent. Louisa found it rather magnificent as well, though the wonder of it had not entirely faded. She still woke some mornings convinced the entire thing had been an elaborate dream, that she would descend to breakfast and find her engagement revealed as delusion. But each time, the sapphire ring on her finger proved the reality, and Henry's daily letters, filled with observations and questions, and the continuing conversation that was the foundation of their connection, reinforced that this impossible thing was truly occurring. The wedding ceremony took place in the chapel at Henry's primary estate, a compromise between the grand London spectacle some had expected and Louisa's own preference for intimacy. As Louisa walked down the aisle on Thomas's arm, her gown a creation of ivory silk that somehow made her strong features appear regal rather than plain, she saw Henry waiting at the altar with an expression of such open joy that any remaining doubts dissolved. This was real. This was chosen. This was right. The vows they exchanged were traditional, but Louisa heard in them new meaning. Promises not of obedience, but of partnership, not of possession, but of mutual respect. When Henry slipped the wedding band onto her finger to join the engagement ring, his hand trembled slightly, revealing that even a duke could be moved by the magnitude of the moment. I love you, he whispered as the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, words he had not spoken before, but that now seemed inevitable. I love you too, Louisa replied, and meant it with every fibre of her being. This man who had seen her when everyone else looked through her, who had valued her mind as much as any physical beauty, who had chosen her specifically and completely. As they emerged from the chapel into spring sunshine, Louisa caught sight of her reflection in the carriage window. The woman looking back at her was unchanged in features, but transformed in bearing, no longer diminished by others' dismissal, but expanded by genuine regard. She was the Duchess of Thornbury now, but more importantly, she was Louisa who had learned that being truly seen was worth more than being conventionally admired, that substance mattered more than surface, and that the greatest love stories often begin not with beauty, but with honest recognition of worth. Have you ever felt invisible, overlooked, dismissed as insufficient by a world that measures worth in shallow ways? Remember that being seen for who you truly are matters infinitely more than being admired for what you appear to be. May you rest tonight, knowing your true worth exists independent of others' recognition, and may you find the courage to believe in possibilities that seem impossible. You are seen, you are valued, and you deserve connection built on authentic recognition rather than superficial assessment. Thank you for watching this story to the end. Like, subscribe, and comment where you are watching from.